He already knew her name. That was the part that broke her. Not the cold air rushing in when he pulled the grate open. Not his eyes, dark and steady as river stones, finding her crouched in the dark like an animal. Not even the silence that followed, the kind of silence that has weight and teeth. It was the way he said Maria Langford. Unhurried, precise, like a man reading from a ledger he had kept for years, that told her the ground she thought she'd been standing on had never been ground at all. It had been his palm, and he had simply chosen, until this moment, to keep it open. 6 years. She had survived 6 years inside the walls of the most dangerous palace in Arkansas. She had eaten dust and shadows and called it freedom. She had watched a king through iron grates and told herself she was invisible. She had never been invisible. And the worst part, the part that would keep her awake for weeks afterward, pressing itself against the inside of her ribs like something that needed to get out, was that he wasn't angry. He was amused. "I think it's time you paid me your rent." The question that should have destroyed her in that moment wasn't "what will he do to me?" It was something far more dangerous. Why did he wait? Let's go back. Because to understand what happened on that February night, to understand why a 25-year-old woman was crouching barefoot in a hollow inside a palace wall with dust in her hair and stone-cold terror in her chest, you have to understand what Arkansas looked like 6 years before. And you have to understand what kind of desperation makes a person choose the wolf's den over the open road. Arkansas in the Northern Territories was not the Arkansas most people knew. It wasn't the one with the state fairs and the catfish restaurants and the long flat highways cutting through farmland. The Northern Territory, everything above the Ozark line, everything where the ridges got serious and the tree cover thickened into something that felt deliberately concealing, belonged to the wolf clans. Had always belonged to them. The human settlements south of the line mostly pretended the North didn't exist, the way people pretend not to see a scar on someone's face. You knew it was there. You knew better than to mention it. The clans governed themselves by a system of pacts, old agreements sealed in blood and witnessed by lunar cycles, drafted long before anyone thought to write a constitution. These pacts covered everything: land rights, trade agreements, territorial boundaries, and most brutally debt collection. A blood debt passed from parent to child the same way a name did. You didn't ask for it. You didn't consent to it. You simply woke up one day and discovered that the weight of someone else's obligation had transferred to your shoulders in the night, quiet as a curse. Maria Langford woke up to that weight on a Thursday morning in April, 3 days after she'd buried her mother in the soft ground behind their rented house in Fayetteville. The Blackthorn representative arrived before the funeral flowers had finished wilting. He was a thin man with a leather satchel and the kind of practiced sympathy that lives entirely in the eyebrows while the mouth stays businesslike. He laid the debt document on her kitchen table, real paper, not digital, because blood packs were old things that didn't trust screens. And he explained the terms in the tone of someone reading a weather report. Her mother had borrowed a sum. The sum had compounded. The interest was written in the old tradition, which meant it was not a number so much as a sentence. 15 years of bonded service, or full repayment, whichever came first. He slid the document across the table and waited. Maria looked at the number. The number was not a number any 20-year-old working a waitress shift at a diner in Fayetteville could ever repay. Not in 15 years. Not in 50. It had been designed that way. She understood that immediately with the cold clarity that arrives when a person's last illusion dissolves. She signed nothing. She said nothing. She waited until the thin man with the satchel left, and then she sat in her mother's kitchen for a long time, looking at the spot where her mother used to stand to make coffee, and she thought about what running north would mean. Not south. South was too obvious, too flat, too easy to search. South was where a frightened human girl was supposed to run. North was where you only went if you had lost your mind or lost everything else first. Maria had lost everything else. She packed a bag that night. She was on the road before sunrise. The journey north took 4 days on foot, cutting through the Ozarks on trails that weren't on any map she owned. She slept under tree cover and moved at dawn and dusk. Twice she heard vehicles on the ridge roads above her and pressed herself flat against hillsides until the sound passed. The Blackthorns would have sent trackers by now, she knew that. The old packs gave them that right. A debt-bound runner could be retrieved by force within the first 30 days. After 30 days, the pact entered a legal gray zone that most clan lawyers argued about endlessly without resolution. Maria's plan was to disappear so completely that the 30 days passed before anyone could find her. After that, she would figure out the rest. What she had not fully planned was where, specifically, she intended to disappear to. Thornhaven Palace resolved that question for her. She saw it first from a ridge on the fourth evening. A vast stone structure built into the northern face of a bluff, the kind of building that looked like it had grown from the rock rather than been constructed on top of it. It was enormous in a way that photographs never captured correctly, the scale of it only becoming real when you were close enough to see that what you had assumed were decorative stones were actually full-sized boulders, stacked and fitted with a precision that spoke of either extraordinary craft or extraordinary power. Probably both. Torches burned in iron brackets along the outer walls, and the smell of wood smoke reached her from 300 yards out. She should have been terrified. Later, she would spend a great deal of time examining why she hadn't been. And the best answer she ever arrived at was that fear requires a future to protect, and she had not been carrying much future at that moment. She had $30-some in her pocket, a change of clothes, and the Blackthorn debt document folded up in the bottom of her bag because she had taken it as evidence of the thing that was hunting her. She had nothing to lose that she hadn't already had taken. Welcome back to the channel, my dear friends. Before we dive deeper into the story, kindly click subscribe. Like this video and tell me in the comments which country you are watching from. Your support helps me bring you more thrilling stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now let's get into the story. She circled the palace twice before she found the crack. It was on the eastern face, low to the ground, where the foundation met a stone drainage channel that ran along the base of the wall. The mortar there was old, different from the restoration work she could see higher up on the same wall, where someone had repointed the joints within the last decade. This section was original, 2 centuries old, and one of the foundation stones had shifted, just slightly, creating a gap that was dark and narrow and cold and smelled of iron and old wood and the dust of sealed things. Maria had been a small woman even before 4 days of walking on minimal food. She had always been lean in the way people who grew up with not quite enough become lean. Not by design, but by circumstance. She went in head first, pulling her bag behind her, scraping her shoulders on both sides simultaneously, and she kept moving because the alternative was going backward, and backward was the direction the blackthorns were coming from. What she found on the other side of that gap changed everything. The passage was roughly 2 feet wide and tall enough to crouch walk through without touching the ceiling. It ran parallel to the exterior wall for about 20 feet before branching. One branch heading deeper into what she would later understand was the eastern kitchen wing. One branch heading upward at a shallow angle via a set of stone steps that had been worn smooth by use, but were thick with undisturbed dust. Old use. Long ago use. The steps had not been walked in many years. She followed the kitchen branch first, because the warmth was coming from that direction. After 4 nights in the Ozarks in April, warmth was not a preference. It was a biological imperative. The passage behind the kitchen wall was extraordinary. Running the entire length of the north-facing kitchen wall was a hollow space approximately 3 feet deep, clearly original construction. A ventilation system, or a maintenance corridor for the massive hearth that dominated the room on the other side. The hearth was so large and its heat so significant that the builders had apparently built in a buffer zone to prevent the outer wall from cracking under thermal expansion. That buffer zone was, as of this moment, Maria Langford's new home. She pressed her palm flat against the stone and felt the warmth move through it like a slow pulse. On the other side of that wall, copper pots hung from iron hooks. Bread cooled on wooden boards. A fire burned in the hearth with the confident, well-fed intensity of a fire that had been carefully built by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. She could hear, faint but distinct, the sound of someone humming in a low register, the kind of humming that happens when a person is alone and comfortable and not thinking about being heard. Maria pressed her back against the warm stone and slid down until she was sitting on the passage floor, knees to her chest. She was inside the walls of Thornhaven Palace. She was technically in the heart of the most powerful Wolf Clan territory in northern Arkansas. She was 20 years old and exhausted and hungry and filthy from 4 days of mountain hiking. And she was, for the first time since the thin man had laid the debt document on her kitchen table, completely safe. Nobody hunts for a rabbit inside the wolf's den. She closed her eyes. She listened to the fire breathe on the other side of the wall. And despite everything, despite the cold stone under her, despite the dust despite the absolute insanity of every decision she had made in the last 4 days. She felt the locked muscles in her shoulders begin slowly to release. She didn't mean to fall asleep, but she was so warm and so tired, and the rhythm of that fire was so steady and so certain that her body simply made the decision without consulting her. She slept for 18 hours. When she woke, the sounds on the other side of the wall had changed. The kitchen was in full operation now. Multiple voices, the clang of cookware, the rhythmic thud of knives on cutting boards. She could smell roasting meat and herbs and something sweet, baked and golden. Her stomach made a sound that she was grateful no one could hear. She waited. She watched through the first grate she found. A ventilation slot set low in the wall, about 8 inches wide and 3 inches tall, angled so that it let heat out and light in, but made a direct sight line from the outside nearly impossible. Through it, she could see the lower third of the kitchen. Stone floor, the legs of a heavy central table, the feet of 2 kitchen workers moving back and forth in a purposeful rhythm. She waited until they both moved away from the central table simultaneously. One to the far hearth, one through the door to what sounded like a larder. And then she moved. She had the grate out in 4 seconds. Her arm through, fingers finding the edge of the table, closing around a bread roll and 2 potatoes and the heel of what felt like a roasted bird. Back through. Grate replaced. 6 seconds total. She ate in the dark with the focused, unsentimental efficiency of someone who has decided that survival takes precedence over dignity. That was day 1. 30 days passed. The Blackthorn tracking window closed. Maria did not leave. Not on day 31. Not on day 60. She told herself she was waiting until it was truly safe, until she had a plan, until she had resources enough to run somewhere the Blackthorns couldn't follow. But weeks became months, and months developed their own architecture, routines, rhythms, small daily victories. And somewhere in that first year, the honest truth settled in whether she wanted it or not. She wasn't staying because it was strategically sound. She was staying because, for the first time in her life, no one was asking anything of her. Not her labor. Not her compliance. Not her silence or her smallness or her careful management of someone else's comfort. The palace walls asked nothing. They gave warmth and concealment and the strange luxury of pure invisibility, and Maria, who had spent her entire life being seen only when she was needed and ignored the rest of the time, found that invisibility felt, against all reason, like freedom. She expanded her territory carefully. The upward-sloping passage from the eastern branch led to a second level of maintenance corridors that ran through the inner palace walls. By the 3rd month, she had mapped nearly the entire eastern wing. By the 6th, she had found passages that connected to the northern face. And it was from the northern face, through a ventilation grate set high in the wall of the war room, that she first saw Thomas McFarland clearly. Not glimpsed. Not partially. Clearly. He was standing at the head of a long table, surrounded by 6 men in various states of agitation. Maps were spread across the table's surface. Voices were raised, everyone's except his. He stood with his arms crossed and his weight slightly back, watching the argument develop with the expression of a man who had already made up his mind and was waiting for everyone else to arrive at the same conclusion. His dark hair was loose, falling past his jaw, and the firelight from the room's east wall hearth caught the planes of his face in a way that made him look more like a sculpture than a person. Something carved with intention by someone who understood exactly where to put the hard edges and where to leave things unresolved. Then one of the arguing men, a heavy-set advisor in a gray coat, said something that must have crossed a line Maria couldn't identify from her position. And Thomas uncrossed his arms and picked up a goblet from the table with the calm deliberateness of a man selecting a tool, and threw it at the advisor's head with the matter-of-fact accuracy of someone who had clearly done this before. The goblet connected with the man's shoulder. The man sat down very quickly. The room went silent. Thomas looked around the table. "Are we finished?" he said. His voice was low. It carried anyway. Nobody answered. He nodded once, picked up a pen, and signed the document at the center of the map. Meeting over. Maria realized she was holding her breath. She released it as quietly as she could and pressed herself back against the passage wall, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. He was not what she had expected. She had expected cruelty worn openly, the way powerful men in old stories wore it. Displayed and decorative, meant to remind you of your position. What she had seen instead was something more unsettling. Restraint. Control. The kind of authority that doesn't need to announce itself because it is simply fundamentally real in a way that announcement would only diminish. She went back to her hollow behind the kitchen wall that night and lay with her back against the warm stone and stared at the ceiling and thought about that goblet. She thought about it for a very long time. That was month 6. She had no idea in that moment that she would be there for 6 more years. And she had absolutely no idea that the man whose goblet throw she was busy analyzing in the dark, the Alpha King, the most powerful person in northern Arkansas, the man whose walls had been her shelter and her world for half a year, had known she was there since almost the very beginning. But that revelation would come later. Much later. First, Maria had a great deal more living to do inside the walls, and Thomas McFarland had a great deal more waiting. What would you have done in Maria's position? Stayed inside the walls, or taken the risk of running? Drop your answer in the comments, because the choice she made next changed absolutely everything. Chapter 2 is coming, and the moment Maria realizes the walls have been listening back. Chapter 27:22 AM Chapter 2. The King Who Watched. Here is the thing about silence that nobody tells you. It is not empty. Silence, when you live inside it long enough, becomes textured. It develops layers the way sediment does, slowly, under pressure, over time. There is the silence of early morning, which is thin and gray and holds its breath. There is the silence of deep night, which is thick and absolute and almost kind. There is the silence that follows a raised voice, which is a different animal entirely, sharp-edged and waiting, the kind that makes the air feel like it has a temperature. Maria Langford had learned to read silence the way other people read faces. By year 2 inside the walls of Thornhaven Palace, she could tell the mood of an entire room from the quality of its quiet before she ever pressed her eye to a grate. And the silence of Thomas McFarland's private study, she had come to understand, was the most complex silence in the entire palace. It was the silence of a man who thought in complete sentences. She had found the study passage in her 8th month. It was a narrow channel running behind the north and west walls of the room, created by what appeared to be a structural anomaly, a point where the inner and outer palace walls had been built at slightly different thicknesses, creating a cavity that the original builders had either not noticed or not cared about. The cavity was barely 18 inches wide. Maria could stand in it sideways and watch the room through a gap where 2 stones had never quite met flush, a vertical seam roughly a 1/4 inch wide that ran from knee height to shoulder height and let through both light and sound with remarkable clarity. She had not intended to make a habit of watching him there. She told herself the first dozen times that she was conducting reconnaissance, learning the palace's rhythms, identifying potential threats, understanding the power structures that governed the building she was living inside. These were reasonable things to know. These were survival-relevant observations. By the 30th visit, she had stopped explaining it to herself. Thomas McFarland worked late. That was the first thing she learned. The kitchen staff was long since finished, and the guard rotation had cycled twice before the candlelight in his study window, visible from the exterior grate she sometimes used on warm nights, finally dimmed. He read constantly. Not reports, though he read those too, but actual books, thick, worn-spine things he pulled from floor-to-ceiling shelves that occupied the study's entire western wall. He had a habit of reading standing up, leaning against the shelves with one ankle crossed over the other, like a man too restless to commit to sitting but too absorbed to actually pace. Occasionally, he would close the book on his finger to hold his place and stare at the middle distance with the particular focused blankness of someone working through a problem that the book had raised rather than answered. He argued with the books sometimes, out loud, under his breath. Maria found this extraordinarily difficult to reconcile with the goblet. The man who had thrown that goblet with cold, precise, entirely controlled aggression did not seem like the same man who stood alone at 10 o'clock at night, one ankle crossed over the other, muttering disagreements at a philosophy text. And yet they were plainly the same person, and this contradiction interested her more than anything she had encountered in her previous life, which now felt as remote and flat as a photograph of a place she'd visited once. Year 2 taught her his schedule. Year 3 taught her his character. She learned that he was fair in a way that cost him something. When a dispute came before him, and disputes came before him constantly, because being the Alpha King of Northern Arkansas meant being the final word on everything from territorial boundary arguments to succession claims to the occasional accusation of a pact violation. He listened longer than anyone seemed to expect. His advisors would present their positions and then look at him with the body language of people expecting a quick verdict, and he would sit with the problem for a long, uncomfortable silence while everyone else in the room tried not to shift in their seats. He asked questions that made the questioner feel slightly exposed. Not because the questions were cruel, but because they were accurate. The kind of questions that find the exact point where a person's reasoning gets shaky and press on it gently until the shakiness becomes visible. He ruled a population that was roughly 60% wolf clan and 40% human. The humans in his territory were not enslaved. That was something Maria had taken some time to confirm, given where she'd come from. But they were not equal either, in the way that most systems that aren't actively cruel are also not actively just. They occupied a middle ground that was comfortable enough not to ignite rebellion and uncomfortable enough to be a slow, permanent weight. Thomas seemed to understand this. He made adjustments at the margins, a trade regulation here, a taxation revision there, a ruling on a pact dispute that quietly expanded human protections without anyone calling it that. His advisors sometimes pushed back on these adjustments, and he listened to that pushback too, with the same long silence and sharp questions. He didn't always win, but he was always trying. Maria had not expected that. By the end of year 3, she had a problem, and she knew it clearly enough to name it. She had developed something that felt uncomfortably like respect for the man whose food she had been stealing for 36 months. She dealt with this by expanding her scavenging operations to the West Wing larder, where the quantities of stored food were large enough that strategic removal was significantly less likely to be noticed. She also found a water access point in the northern maintenance corridor, a slow-dripping pipe joint that she had redirected, with materials scavenged from a storage room she'd located in the basement passage, into a small ceramic bowl she'd appropriated from a shelf in the back of the larder. She had a water source, a food source, and 2 sleeping hollows, the primary one behind the kitchen wall, and a secondary one in the second-floor passage near the library wing, which ran warm from the heated stone of the library's fireplace. She had, against all probability, built a life. It was small. It was constrained in ways that most people would find suffocating. She had no one to talk to, nothing to read, no window that showed her the actual sky. But she had discovered something inside those walls that she had never had in her previous life. Time. Unstructured, unpressured, ungoverned time. Time that belonged entirely to her, with no one's needs claiming it and no one's expectations shaping it. She used it to think, deep, unhurried thinking of the kind that had never been available to her when she was working double shifts and managing her mother's declining health and watching the debt accumulate on a clock she couldn't stop. She thought about the world she'd come from. She thought about the world she was watching through the grates. She thought about fairness and power and the strange, recursive irony of finding safety in the one place everyone would have said was the most dangerous. She thought more than she intended to about Thomas. Year 4 brought the first scare. It came in the form of a palace inspection. A structural engineer had apparently flagged concerns about the Eastern Foundation, the very section of foundation that contained Maria's entry point, and a team of 3 men arrived on a Thursday morning in October to conduct an assessment. Maria found out about this from the war room great 2 days before it happened, when Thomas signed off on the work order while his estate manager stood at his shoulder reading from a clipboard. She spent those 2 days doing the most terrified, methodical work of her life. She covered her traces in the Eastern Passage first. The subtle smoothing of dust that indicated regular foot traffic, the faint impression where she'd worn the stones slightly smoother in her most used path. She moved her stored items, the ceramic bowl, the small collection of tools she'd accumulated, the single folded blanket she'd eventually retrieved from a chest in an upper storage room, to the second-floor passage, which the engineers had no reason to access. She blocked her entry crack from the inside using loose stones she'd long since loosened as a precaution, fitting them back into the gap with the quiet precision of someone who had spent years learning the exact weight and texture of every stone in her world. Then she climbed to the highest passage she'd found, a narrow horizontal channel beneath the roofline of the palace's eastern wing, accessible via a vertical shaft she'd discovered at the end of the second-floor corridor, and she stayed there for 2 days without moving more than was absolutely necessary. The engineers worked directly below her for 6 hours on the first day. She could hear their voices clearly, technical language, measurements, the occasional note of disagreement about a reading. She lay flat in the roofline channel, breathing shallowly, and listened to three men discuss the structural integrity of the walls she had been living inside for 4 years. The entry crack, one of them said, was not a structural problem. It was cosmetic, old mortar shrinkage, extremely common in foundation stones of this age. They would repoint it from the exterior. Nothing to worry about. The entry crack was repointed from the exterior the following Tuesday. Maria, by then back in her primary hollow, pressed her palm against the newly sealed gap and felt the changed texture of fresh mortar under her fingers. Her exit route was gone. She sat with that for a long time. When she had finished sitting with it, she went systematically through every inch of the passages she knew and mapped every alternative exit she could locate. She found two: a ground floor window well in the north basement, accessible through a removable stone panel she'd noticed months ago but never tested, and a door in the sub-basement level, iron-bound old, almost certainly not in active use, that she could reach from the lowest maintenance corridor. She filed both away with the methodical calm of someone who had learned that panic uses the same energy as planning and produces significantly worse results. She was not trapped. She had exits. She simply had no particular desire to use them. That realization arrived in the same quiet, undramatic way that most of her most significant realizations arrived. Not as a revelation, but as an acknowledgement of something she had already known for a while. She didn't want to leave. And it wasn't just about the Blackthorns anymore, though the Blackthorn debt was still technically active and would be for another 9 years. It wasn't just safety. It wasn't just the warmth or the food or the strange, compressed freedom of the passages. It was him. She said it plainly to herself, there in the dark with her palm against the sealed crack, because she had found over 4 years of solitude that the fastest way to diffuse a dangerous thought was to say it directly and let it exist without dressing it up or explaining it away. She had feelings for Thomas McFarland. Complicated, impractical, essentially absurd feelings for a man she had never spoken to, never been in the same room as, never touched or been seen by. A man who was a wolf and a king, and who had once thrown a goblet at someone's head with the calm of a person signing a letter. A man who argued with books at 10 at night and made rulings that protected people who had no particular political power and ate dinner alone at a long table with dispatches open beside his plate. Food going cold because he was too busy reading to eat it properly. She had watched him for 4 years and built a complete and detailed understanding of exactly who he was. And the person she had built from all those fragments was someone she could not stop thinking about. This was, she acknowledged, a significant problem. She managed it the way she managed most problems, with discipline and routine. She reduced her visits to the study passage. She focused her observations on the war room and the kitchen wing, where the information was more strategically useful and the emotional exposure was more manageable. She worked on her passages. She maintained her systems. She kept her world tight and ordered and under control. Year 5 unraveled that strategy completely. It began with the night he didn't sleep. She had been in the kitchen passage, her most familiar hollow, the one that still felt most like home, when she heard the sound of footsteps in the adjacent corridor at 2 in the morning. Not the guard rotation. The guards had a rhythm she knew as well as her own heartbeat, and this was not it. These were single-person steps, slow and uneven in a way she'd never heard from Thomas before, and the uneven quality was not injury but thought, the walk of a man too burdened to move with his usual deliberate precision. She tracked him through the passage system by sound, moving parallel to his route through the inner corridors, until he arrived in the kitchen. She heard the scrape of a chair. A long silence. And then, she pressed her ear against the stone. A sound she had not heard from him in 5 years of observation. A long, slow exhale. The kind that comes from somewhere beneath the lungs. The kind that a person makes when they have been holding something for a very long time and the hour is late enough and the room empty enough that they finally, briefly, let it down. Maria sat on the other side of the wall and listened to Thomas McFarland sit alone in his kitchen in the middle of the night and simply be tired. Not the controlled tiredness he allowed himself in public. That slight tightening around the eyes that she'd cataloged and categorized. The only visible concession he made to human limitation during working hours. This was the other kind. The kind that lives underneath the control, that only surfaces in the dark when there's no one to perform steadiness for. He sat there for 40 minutes. She sat on the other side of the wall for all 40 of them. She did not press her eye to the grate. She didn't need to see him. It felt, somehow, like it would be wrong to see him in that particular moment, like the seeing would make it smaller than it was. When he finally left and his footsteps faded back toward the upper corridors, Maria leaned her head against the warm stone and closed her eyes and understood, with the complete and irreversible clarity that only arrives when you have been avoiding a truth long enough that it has outgrown all your avoidance, that she was in serious trouble. Not the kind of trouble that comes from being discovered. That trouble she could plan around. She'd been planning around it for 5 years. This was the other kind. The kind that lives in the chest. The kind that doesn't have a passage to retreat into. Year 5 became year 6, and year 6 brought changes that Maria could neither explain nor control. She began making mistakes. Small ones at first. A shadow in the wrong place. Her hand moving past the light from a grate at the wrong moment. A soft sound in a passage she'd thought empty. A guard looking sharply at a wall for a half-second before moving on. She caught each mistake before it compounded, but they were happening with a frequency that should have frightened her into a stricter discipline, and instead she found that the discipline was harder to maintain, not easier. As though some part of her was loosening a grip she had held for 6 years, and the loosening was not a decision but a tide. She started arriving at grates without having consciously decided to go there. She started timing her presence in the kitchen passage to coincide with his late-night reading hours, when she could hear the sound of pages turning through the warm stone. She started, in the deep night quiet of her hollow, having conversations in her head that were not surveillance reports or structural assessments but simply talk. The kind of talk she'd watched him have with his books. The kind that goes sideways and gets interesting. She'd take a position and argue it, and then imagine his counterargument with a precision that scared her when she thought about it too directly. Because she had watched him think and argue for long enough that she knew how he would push back, knew the shape of his reasoning, knew the exact questions he would ask that would find the soft point in her logic. She knew him. That was the terrifying part. She had never spoken a word to him, and she knew him better than she had ever known anyone. By the 6th year, the walls felt smaller. Not in their dimensions. Nothing had changed structurally. But the space between a thing that is hidden and a thing that wants to be seen had been narrowing for 12 months, and the narrowing felt less like danger and more like inevitability, which was the most dangerous thing of all. She started making bigger mistakes. And then one cold Tuesday in February, she rounded a corner in the kitchen passage and found the grate already open. The grate that she had removed and replaced so many times over 6 years that it moved silently and smoothly as a thought. The grate she had been certain no one else knew about. Open. Held wide. By a hand. She stopped. The firelight from the kitchen poured through the open grate into the dark passage, and caught in that light, crouching with her arms wrapped around her knees and dust in her hair and her heart trying to leave her body through her sternum, Maria Langford stared at Thomas McFarland. He was leaning against the kitchen table, arms crossed, completely relaxed, watching her with those dark, fathomless eyes. And he was not surprised. Not even slightly. Maria Langford, he said. Her full name, both syllables of each word given equal, unhurried weight. 6 years. 3 months. 11 days. The pause that followed was the most complete silence she had ever heard. I think, Thomas said, and something at the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile exactly, but the suggestion of one, the controlled precursor to one, held back with the same deliberate patience he brought to everything. It's time you paid me your rent. Maria stared at him, and for the first time in 6 years, she had absolutely no idea what was going to happen next. That was the part, she would later realize, that should have told her everything. She had stopped being afraid of the unknown the moment the unknown had a specific face. She didn't move for a full 30 seconds. Later, she would count them. She had a habit, developed over 6 years of enforced stillness, of counting seconds during moments of crisis. It gave the mind something to do while the body decided whether to fight or flee or freeze. 1 1,000. 2 1,000. The fire crackled behind him. 3 1,000. He didn't move either. 4 1,000. His arms stayed crossed, his weight easy against the table edge, his expression holding that infuriating not-quite smile with the patience of a man who had nowhere else to be. 5 1,000. The copper pots above the hearth caught the firelight and threw it in slow orange arcs across the kitchen ceiling. 6 1,000. On 30, she made her decision. She straightened up from her crouch slowly, with what dignity a person can assemble when they are barefoot, and wearing clothes that had been mended so many times the original fabric was now outnumbered by the patches, and she stepped through the open grate into the kitchen. Her feet hit the stone floor. Real stone, unmediated by the thin layer of dust and debris that coated her passage floors. The texture of it was different, colder, harder, more present, and the sensation traveled up through her soles and into her legs with an immediacy that made her breath catch. She had been in this kitchen 10,000 times in her head and 0 times in her body. The difference was considerable. The room was enormous. She had known its dimensions by sound and smell and the partial sight lines of her grates. But knowing and standing inside were different countries. The ceiling was high and vaulted. The stone walls hung with iron cookware in graduated sizes. The central table scarred with decades of knife work. The hearth so large she could have stood inside it upright with room to spare. The smell of the room, wood smoke, roasted meat, herbs she had identified by scent but never by sight, hit her with a fullness that the filtered version through the walls had never provided. She stood in the middle of all of it and looked at Thomas McFarland. Up close, he was realer than he had any right to be. She had constructed him, over 6 years, from fragments. The line of his jaw caught in firelight, the sound of his voice carrying through stone, the shape of his silhouette moving past grates. The assembled version had been accurate in its parts, but somehow not quite adequate to the whole. The way a map is accurate, but is still not the territory. The man standing against the kitchen table was the territory. He was taller than she had calibrated. The dark eyes were steadier. The stillness was more complete. Not the absence of movement, but the presence of absolute control over it, a distinction that her body registered as a separate category of information from her brain. And he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. Not predatory. Not angry. Not the cold calculation she had braced for. Something more complicated than any of those. A layered look, the kind that has several things in it simultaneously and makes no effort to clarify which is on top. "You're shorter than I expected," he said. Of all the things she had prepared herself to hear, that was not among them. "I've been crouching for 6 years," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. It was slightly roughened from disuse. She rarely spoke aloud in the passages, had long since broken the habit of talking to herself because sound traveled in ways she couldn't always predict. But it was functional. It was hers. Something shifted in his expression. "Fair," he said. He uncrossed his arms and moved to the table, pulling out the chair at its near end with the unhurried motion of a man setting up a meeting he had scheduled in advance. He sat down, leaned back, and looked at her from this new angle. "Sit down, Maria." "I'd rather stand." "I know," he said. "Sit down anyway." She sat. Not because she was afraid of him. She had moved past afraid somewhere around the 3rd year. In the way you move past a thing that has been present too long to maintain its charge. She sat because the word anyway was not a command dressed as a suggestion. It was an acknowledgement that she had a preference and a request to set it aside. And those two things offered simultaneously was not a dynamic she had experienced very often from people with more power than her. It was disarming in a way that outright authority could not have been. She sat in the chair at the table's corner, perpendicular to him. Close enough to be in the same conversation. Far enough to have an exit vector. Old habits. Thomas looked at her for a moment with that layered expression. Then he stood up, walked to the hearth, took a plate from the warming shelf above the fire, and set it in front of her. Roasted chicken. Bread. Potatoes cooked with something green and fragrant. A cup of something warm. She could smell apple and spice. Maria looked at the food. Then at him. Then at the food again. "You're feeding me," she said. "You've been stealing from my kitchen for 6 years," he said, sitting back down. "I thought I'd see what you looked like when you ate something intentionally placed in front of you." She looked up at him sharply. He was watching her with that expression again. And now she could identify the top layer. It was curiosity. Genuine, undisguised, intellectually serious curiosity. The same expression she had seen him turn on books that challenged him, on treaty disputes that had interesting internal contradictions, on problems that didn't yield to easy answers. He was looking at her the way he looked at things he found genuinely interesting. Maria picked up the bread. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Month 4, he said. She set the bread back down. "Month 4, she repeated. "You took a tomato from the kitchen sill in August of your 1st year." He said it without any particular emphasis, as if reciting a fact from a document. The tomato was positioned precisely at the edge of the sill. I'd put it there myself. The window above the sill showed the grate displacement. There was a print in the dust on the outer ledge of the grate, a fingerprint, partial, small. Human-sized. I had the kitchen grates checked the following morning. One of them had been removed and replaced recently. The dust pattern on the floor below it was disturbed in a way consistent with someone exiting and re-entering from a low passage. She stared at him. You put the tomato there on purpose. I put the tomato there on purpose, he confirmed. To test whether someone was in the walls. To confirm, he said. I already suspected. One of my guards reported a shadow in the east passage window 3 weeks prior. No one had been assigned to that section. He picked up his own cup, something darker, older smelling than hers, and took a measured sip. A ghost doesn't cast shadows. A living person does. Maria's mind was doing several things simultaneously, which made it difficult to prioritize a response. Somewhere below the immediate shock of this information, month 4, he had known since month 4, a second, larger shock was assembling itself, slower and heavier. If he had known since month 4. If he had confirmed it with the tomato in August. If he had been aware, with certainty, for 5 years and 8 months. You didn't remove me, she said. No. Why? The question sat between them in the firelit kitchen. The fire settled, sending a brief fountain of sparks up into the flue. Thomas looked at her over the rim of his cup. That's an interesting question, he said. What answer would you believe? I don't know yet, Maria said. Give me the true one, and I'll tell you if I believe it. Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile. That thing that lived next to a smile, but was more serious and more deliberate. He set his cup down. I ran a check on you the day after I confirmed your presence, he said. Maria Langford, Fayetteville, Arkansas. 20 years old. No clan affiliation. No criminal record. One outstanding blood debt to the Blackthorn clan. Inherited from your mother, who died in April of that year. He paused. The Blackthorns had filed a retrieval request with the Northern Territorial Registry. Standard procedure for a debt runner. Another pause shorter. I denied the request. Maria heard the words. She processed them. She put them in order. She looked at Thomas McFarland across the kitchen table and felt the ground. That same metaphorical ground she had thought was solid before and had turned out to be his open palm, shift again. You denied the Blackthorns' retrieval request, she said carefully. I did. For me. For a debt runner who had entered my territory, he said, with a precision that was doing a great deal of work. That falls within my jurisdictional authority. The Blackthorns were informed that the retrieval window had closed without my authorization to extend it. Which was accurate. That's technically true, Maria said slowly. But it's not the whole story. No, Thomas agreed. It isn't. The fire crackled. The copper pots turned slowly in a draft from somewhere. Maria looked at the man across the table. The man she had watched for 6 years, whose silhouette she could identify from 30 feet through a smoke-hazed grate, whose thinking patterns she understood better than she had ever understood anyone, whose midnight exhaustion she had sat with on the other side of a wall. And she understood suddenly and completely that the conversation they were having had been building for 5 years and 8 months. That every edged silence in the war room and every late-night reading session she'd observed and every meal she'd watched him eat alone at this exact table had been, not a performance, because he hadn't known the specific quality of her attention, but a kind of accumulated reality, building up on both sides of a wall, and the wall was now gone. The rent, she said. What does that mean? Thomas leaned forward, elbows on the table. This was a new posture. She had never seen him lean forward in a meeting. He had always held himself back, held the space, let the information come to him. Leaning forward was a different gesture. A deliberate one. My territory has a problem, he said. I have a human population that is functionally without an advocate. My council is composed entirely of clan members. Every decision that passes through that council is filtered through clan interests first and human interests as an afterthought, regardless of my instructions, because that is the nature of filter systems. The filter reflects the material it's made of. He met her eyes. I need someone who thinks from the other side of that filter. Maria looked at him for a long time. You want a human advisor. I want you specifically, he said, which is a different statement. Why me specifically? Because you have spent 6 years in my walls listening to every decision this palace makes from a position of absolute outside-in perspective, he said. You have no clan allegiance, no political debt, no stake in the existing power structures. You understand how this territory actually functions from the position of someone navigating it with no protection and no resources. And you are, he stopped, picked his next word with the visible care of someone who has thought about this. Exceptionally intelligent. The way you mapped my passages. The way you managed your detection risk. The way you solved the water access problem in the northern corridor with a rerouted pipe joint and a ceramic bowl. Those were not the actions of someone simply surviving. Those were engineering solutions. Maria stared at him. You knew about the pipe. I had the maintenance team evaluate it 4 years ago when the North Corridor moisture reading dropped. They found the reroute and reported it as an anomaly. I told them to leave it. She absorbed this. 4 years ago. He had known about the pipe 4 years ago and told them to leave it, which meant he had actively protected her access to water for 4 years, which meant that the extent of what he had done while knowing she was in his walls was larger than the denial of the Blackthorn retrieval request. Much larger. You've been, she stopped. Started again. You've been keeping me safe, she said. This entire time. I've been keeping my options open, Thomas said. The outcome happened to align with your safety. That is such a precise way to say something much simpler, Maria said. That corner of the mouth thing happened again. Closer to a smile this time. Yes, he said. It is. They sat with that for a moment. The rent, Maria said. Is that what you want? Me to be your human council member? That's the payment. That's the starting proposal, Thomas said. You're welcome to negotiate. She looked around the kitchen. Her kitchen, in the way that the space you survive inside becomes yours by accumulation of time and breath and quiet desperation. The copper pots, the long-scarred table, the hearth that had kept her warm through 6 Arkansas winters. I want the debt cleared, she said. The Blackthorn blood debt. I want it dissolved, not just blocked. That requires the Blackthorn's formal agreement, Thomas said, which requires leverage, which I have, in the form of several Blackthorn Pact violations I've been documenting for 3 years, but haven't acted on. You've been holding that leverage. I've been waiting for the right application, he said simply. She looked at him. You've been building toward this conversation for years, she said. He met her eyes. The best outcomes require patience and preparation, he said. In my experience. And then, before she could construct a response to that, a door at the far end of the kitchen opened without warning, and a man stepped through it, broad-shouldered, gray-haired, wearing the formal black of a senior palace advisor and carrying an expression of extreme alarm. Victor Hale, the estate manager. She recognized his voice from 100 war room observations. He stopped dead when he saw her. His eyes traveled from Maria, barefoot, patched clothing, dust in her hair, to Thomas, who had not moved and whose expression had not changed in any way that suggested Victor's entry was anything other than mildly inconvenient. My king, Victor said carefully. There is a young woman in your kitchen. I'm aware, Victor, Thomas said. She appears to be. Victor searched for a word. She appears to have come from inside the walls. Also aware. Victor looked at Maria. Maria looked at Victor. Victor looked back at Thomas with the expression of a man who has many questions and is very uncertain which one to start with. Is she a prisoner? No, Thomas said. Is she a guest? Thomas looked at Maria. And Maria, sitting at the table with a plate of warm food in front of her and 6 years of wall dust in her hair and the most significant conversation of her life still unfinished, made a decision. She had spent 6 years being invisible. 6 years existing in the spaces between things, between the walls, between decisions, between the world she'd come from and the world she could see but couldn't enter. She had been a ghost by necessity, and then by habit, and then by something that had taken her an embarrassingly long time to identify as fear. Not of discovery. Of the moment after discovery. The moment of being seen and being found inadequate. The moment when the inside of the walls turned out to be more hospitable than the outside. But the outside, at this specific moment, had a plate of warm food in it. And a man who had known she was there for 5 years and 8 months, and had protected her water access and blocked her debt retrieval and had been, apparently, waiting for her with a patience she could only describe as extraordinary. She's the new Human Council representative, Maria said, looking at Victor. Victor's eyebrows performed a small acrobatic sequence. He looked at Thomas. Thomas was looking at Maria with that complete, layered, unreadable expression. Then he picked up his cup. That's correct, he said. Effective immediately. He took a sip. Welcome to the table, Maria. Victor looked like a man whose understanding of reality had been updated in several places simultaneously and was still processing the installation. Maria looked at the food in front of her. Real food, warm food, food that had been placed there by another person who had wanted her to have it. She picked up the bread. She took a bite. The warmth of it spread through her chest like the first real thing she had felt in years. But neither she nor Thomas noticed, in that particular warm and firelit moment, the expression on Victor Hale's face as he retreated through the kitchen door. Not the shock of seeing her. Not the confusion about her origins. Something older and sharper than either of those. Something that looked a great deal like recognition. And something that looked, if you watched him long enough, like fear. Victor Hale had seen Maria Langford before. Not here. Not in this palace. And that fact, Maria would discover, was going to change everything she thought she understood about why she had ended up inside these walls in the first place. She slept in a real room for the first time in 6 years. It was a small room, a servant's quarters on the second floor of the eastern wing, sparsely furnished, with a narrow bed and a wool blanket and a window that looked out over the palace's northern courtyard. Thomas had shown her to it himself, without ceremony, carrying a single candle and walking the corridor with the unhurried stride of a man doing a routine thing, as though installing a woman who had been living in his walls for 6 years into a spare room was an administrative matter of ordinary frequency. He had stopped at the door, handed her the candle, and said, "There are clothes in the chest at the foot of the bed. They'll be approximate. We'll get proper measurements taken in the morning." She had looked at him in the candlelight, this man she had known for 6 years without knowing at all, this man who was simultaneously exactly what she had constructed and entirely more than it. And she had said, "You had clothes waiting." "I had a room prepared," he said, without inflection. "How long ago?" The candle moved slightly in a draft. His expression did that thing again. The controlled precursor to something more, held back with deliberate patience. "Get some sleep, Maria," he said, and walked back down the corridor with his hands in his pockets, unhurried, as though the conversation had concluded at the point he had chosen and not a word beyond it. She had stood in the doorway watching him go, and she had thought, he had a room prepared, which meant he had anticipated this moment. Hitch meant the February Tuesday on which he opened the grate had not been a discovery but a chosen date, a conclusion he had decided on and moved toward, while she had been inside the walls slowly dismantling her own discipline without understanding why. She had filed that information in the same place she filed everything complicated about Thomas McFarland, which was a mental folder that had been getting very full for several years, and she had gone inside the room and sat on the edge of the Real bed and felt the real mattress under her for a long moment. Then she had lain down, pulled the wool blanket up, and stared at the ceiling. She did not sleep. Not because the bed was uncomfortable, it was compared to a stone passage floor, so comfortable it almost felt aggressive. But her mind, freed from the immediate practical demands of survival that had structured every hour of the last 6 years, was doing what minds do when the emergency finally lifts. It was unpacking everything it had been holding in compression. Every stored observation, every filed-away question, everything she had noticed and catalogued and set aside for later, now determined that later had arrived. Victor Hale's face kept surfacing. She had seen his expression only for a moment before he had controlled it. That rapid sequence of shock and recognition, and something older and darker underneath. She was good at faces. 6 years of reading people through ventilation grates, where only partial information was available, had made her exceptionally good at reading what the face did in the fraction of a second before the person decided what they wanted their face to do. Victor's face, in that fraction of a second, had done something specific and telling. He had not been surprised to see a woman emerge from the palace walls. He had been surprised to see which woman. That distinction was the thread. She could feel it between her fingers the way you feel a loose thread before you know whether pulling it will tighten the fabric or unravel it entirely. She didn't know yet. But she knew it was there, and she knew it mattered, and she knew that the clean, warm, firelit version of tonight's events that she had been handed was not the whole picture. It never was. She had learned that from 6 years of watching the gap between what was said in formal meetings and what was said when the advisors thought the room was empty. She was out of the walls now. She was sitting at the table, in Thomas's own words. But the thing she had learned from 6 years inside those walls was that where you sat at a table and what you actually understood about what was happening at that table were two entirely different matters. She needed to understand Victor Hale. She was still turning that over when she finally, involuntarily, fell asleep near dawn. Not into the light, easy sleep of someone at rest, but into the dense, pressurized sleep of someone who has been awake for too long and whose body has simply overridden the mind's objections. She dreamed of the passages, dark and warm and entirely familiar. In the dream, they were filling with water. Morning arrived hard and bright through the east-facing window, and with it came a knock at the door, brisk, professional, not Thomas, and a palace staff member named Greta, a compact woman in her 50s with efficient hands and the slightly martyred expression of a person who has been asked to accomplish something on short notice and has decided to accomplish it anyway. Greta had measuring tape and a notepad, and the particular manner of someone who had dressed unusual people in unusual circumstances before and was not going to make it strange. She took measurements. She left clothes, plain but well-made, in colors that would not announce her presence, gray, deep blue, brown. She told Maria that breakfast would be in the East dining room at 8, that the King's Council met at 10, and that she was expected at both. Expected. Maria dressed in the borrowed clothes and stood at the window and looked out at the northern courtyard. The courtyard she had never seen from this angle. From the outside. From a room with a window that had actual light coming through it and actual glass and actual walls that she was inside by invitation rather than infiltration. A groundskeeper was moving through the courtyard below, raking frost-stiffened leaves into a pile. 2 guards were doing a perimeter walk at the far end. A dog, large, dark-coated, moving with the particular purposeful energy of an animal that belongs somewhere, was crossing from the stables to the east door at a trot. Ordinary. Morning. Real. She pressed her palm flat against the window glass and felt the cold of it, sharp and honest. Then she went downstairs. The east dining room was smaller than the great hall she had observed through the upper grates. A working room, meant for functional meals rather than ceremonial ones, with a rectangular table that seated 8 and a sideboard along the south wall laid with food. Thomas was already there, standing at the sideboard with a cup, reading from a folded document. He looked up when she entered and did a brief, almost imperceptible assessment, taking in the clothes, the fact that she had clearly slept, the expression she was wearing, and apparently concluded something from all 3 that satisfied him, because he gave a small nod and went back to the document. She served herself from the sideboard, sat at the table. For a moment they were both quiet, he reading, she eating, and the quality of the quiet was domestic in a way that she had to breathe through carefully, because it was too close to a version of the scene she had constructed in her head in the 5th year and had spent considerable energy dismantling. "Tell me about Victor Hale," she said. Thomas looked up from the document. She met his eyes. His reaction last night. He recognized me. Not as someone who came from your walls. As someone specifically. I need to know what he knows and how. Thomas set the document down. He looked at her for a long moment with that complete assessment gaze. The one that didn't feel invasive so much as precise, like being measured rather than judged. "What makes you certain it was recognition and not shock?" he asked. "Shock presents in the upper face first," she said. "The brow, the eyes. Recognition presents in the lower face, the mouth, the jaw." Victor's lower face moved half a second before his upper face caught up. He knew who I was before his brain had finished deciding how to react to where I'd come from. She paused. "I have spent 6 years reading faces through ventilation grates with incomplete visual information. I do not misread the lower face." Thomas was quiet for 2 seconds. Then, "No, I don't imagine you do." He picked up his cup, set it down, made a decision. "Victor Hale served my father before he served me," he said. "He has been the estate manager of Thornhaven for 23 years. He is competent, loyal in the way that long-serving people are loyal, to the institution as much as the person. And he has one significant blind spot, which is that he believes his value to this palace grants him a latitude of independent judgment that I have not authorized." "What kind of independent judgment?" "The kind that involves making decisions he believes I would want made, without informing me that he's made them," Thomas said. "Small things mostly. Administrative adjustments. Except that approximately 8 years ago, the decision stopped being entirely small." 8 years. Maria set her fork down without meaning to. What happened 8 years ago? She asked. Thomas looked at her. And this time the layered expression had something new in it. Something that looked like it had been there for a while and had been waiting for the right moment to be addressed. 8 years ago, a woman named Catherine Langford came to the Northern Territory boundary requesting an emergency audience with my father. The name hit Maria in the sternum like a physical object. My mother, she said. Her voice was very steady. She was aware of making it steady. Yes. Thomas's voice was level and careful. Not the careful of someone concealing something, but the careful of someone delivering something they know will land hard and want to land it as cleanly as possible. She came to the boundary requesting asylum. She had a blood debt to the Blackthorn clan that she claimed was fraudulent, manufactured by the Blackthorn clan head as a mechanism to acquire land rights to a property your family held in the Southern Territory that the Blackthorns wanted for a mining operation. Maria heard the words. She heard them perfectly. She put them in order. The debt was manufactured, she said. Catherine Langford had documentation supporting that claim, Thomas said. She had the original agreement, the packed witnesses' signatures, and a discrepancy in the lunar witness record that would have invalidated the debt under old pact law. She wanted my father to review the documentation and issue a territorial ruling that would have rendered the debt legally void. He never issued that ruling, Maria said, because I would know if he had. The debt was still active when my mother died. My father never saw the documentation, Thomas said. He was ill that year, the early stages of the sickness that would take him 2 years later. Victor managed his incoming audiences. He had significant discretion over what reached my father's attention and what was, he paused. One precise word. Redirected. The kitchen fire was behind her, and Maria felt its warmth on her back, but the warmth seemed very far away suddenly, and the room seemed very precise and still. Victor redirected my mother, she said. Victor sent her away, Thomas said. I found a record of her visit in the boundary log 14 months ago, while I was auditing the old audience files. Her name, the date, the notation redirected, matter outside territorial purview. Victor's initials. His jaw was set. She could see the controlled anger in it. Not hot anger, but the cold, sustained kind that has been living in a person for a while. It was not outside territorial purview. Fraudulent blood debt claims fall entirely within my family's jurisdictional authority under the same pact laws the debt was filed under. Victor knew that. Why? Maria said slowly. Why would Victor? What did he gain from turning her away? Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, the Blackthorn clan has a long relationship with certain members of my father's administration. Relationships built on a mutual interest in maintaining the existing structure of power, which includes keeping the human population of this territory in a sufficiently economically precarious position that they remain dependent and manageable. A ruling that invalidated a blood debt on the grounds of fraud would have set a precedent. The Blackthorns had other fraudulent debts. Victor had received, I believe, though I have not yet proven, certain considerations from the Blackthorn clan in exchange for managing which human grievances reached my father's attention. He was being paid, Maria said. I believe so. Yes. To keep people like my mother from getting justice. Yes. Maria sat with this information. The dining room was very quiet. Outside the window, the groundskeeper was still raking leaves, unhurried and ordinary, and the world was proceeding with a normalcy that felt profoundly misaligned with what was happening inside Maria's chest. Her mother had had proof. Real proof, legal proof, documentation that could have dissolved the debt and saved the land and changed everything. Changed the entire shape of the life that had followed, changed whether Catherine Langford died in debt-induced poverty in a rented house in Fayetteville, changed whether Maria had spent 6 years inside a palace wall instead of living an open and ordinary life. Her mother had walked to the northern border with that proof in her hands. She had asked for help, and Victor Hale had turned her away because the Blackthorns were paying him to manage exactly that kind of inconvenient justice. You've known this for 14 months, Maria said. Yes. You found the record and you knew Victor had done this, and he is still your estate manager. He is still my estate manager because I needed to build an evidentiary case before acting, Thomas said. Acting without evidence would have given him grounds to dispute the finding and the Blackthorns grounds to challenge any ruling I based on it. The case needed to be airtight. He paused. And because I needed to find you. Maria looked up. The boundary record had your mother's name and the nature of her claim, he said. I knew about the Langford debt. I had already blocked the retrieval request 2 years before I found the record. When I found it, I understood the full shape of what had happened. You were already in my walls. But the situation required a particular kind of approach. You've been building the case for 14 months, Maria said. While I was in your walls. Yes. While I was making mistakes, she said more slowly. In the 6th year. The mistakes that led to tonight. Thomas met her eyes. Said nothing. Did you engineer the mistakes? She asked. The open grate. Did you leave it open, or did I? You made real mistakes, he said. The shadow in the 3rd floor passage in December. The sound in the kitchen corridor in January. Those were yours. I simply decided that when the next opportunity arose, I would take it. He paused. But Maria, I want to be precise about something. She waited. I would have called you out of the walls when the case was ready, he said. Regardless, the timing was yours. Your mistakes accelerated it, but the destination was fixed. He held her gaze with that complete, undeflected steadiness. You were always going to be at this table. The fire crackled. The groundskeeper finished with the leaves. Maria thought about her mother, standing at the northern border with proof in her hands. Then she thought about what came next. The evidence you've built, she said. The Blackthorn Pact violations. My mother's documentation. Do you have it? Victor redirected your mother, but he kept records. He kept everything. The documentation is in a locked file in his office. I have not retrieved it yet because retrieving it prematurely would alert him. Thomas paused. I have been waiting for the right moment. You keep saying that, Maria said. The right moment. The right application. You have been waiting for a very long time for a great number of right moments. Effective action requires. I know, she said. I heard you say it to your counsel in the 3rd year. Through the war room grate. She looked at him steadily. But here is the thing about waiting for the right moment, Thomas. Sometimes the right moment passes. My mother's right moment passed. She waited too long, trusted the wrong system, believed that the correct process would produce a just outcome. She put both hands flat on the table. I've been waiting for 6 years. I'm done waiting. Something happened in his expression. Not surprise. Something more significant than surprise. He was seeing her clearly, perhaps for the first time. Not the woman in the walls, not the intelligence report, not the patience and the survival and the carefully managed invisibility, but the person underneath all of that, the person who had been building a very slow and very quiet kind of fury for 6 years and was now sitting at his table with it out in the open. What do you want to do? He said. Tonight, Maria said. Victor's office. We get the documentation. We build the case into something we can use publicly, not just administratively. And then, she stopped, breathed. And then I want to stand in a room with the Blackthorn clan head and watch him dissolve my mother's debt in front of witnesses. I want it done in the old way, the same way it was made. Blood and moon and witnesses. I want it gone so completely that there is no version of any record anywhere that says the Langford family ever owed those people anything. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. That's achievable, he said. I know it is, Maria said. That's why I said it. That corner of his mouth. Closer to a smile than she had ever seen it go in 6 years of watching. Tonight then, he said. But neither of them saw, as they made their plans across the breakfast table in the firelit east dining room, what Victor Hale was doing at that same moment in his office 2 floors above them. He was not sleeping. He was not eating breakfast. He was writing a letter. And the letter was addressed to the Blackthorn clan head. And the letter had one sentence. She is out of the walls. The letter reached the Blackthorn clan house by mid-morning. Maria didn't know that yet. She was sitting in her first council meeting, at the far end of a long table in the war room. The war room she had memorized from above, whose every stone and shadow she could have mapped blindfolded, whose dimensions she knew by the sound of voices bouncing off its walls, but which she was now inside, physically seated, present in a way that kept requiring her to readjust her internal calibration, like a person learning to walk after years of crawling. There were 6 council members besides Thomas. She had named them all in her head over the years. The Goblet Incident Man, whose real name was Aldous Crane and who was a senior territorial administrator, heavy-set, careful, perpetually slightly defensive. The young one, who was actually 32 and named Patrick Reeve, a land rights specialist who asked sharp questions and took notes in a small leather book. The quiet woman, who was Dorothea Wells, the only other female council member, who had served since Thomas's father's time, and who watched everything with the steady patience of someone who had outlasted a great many people who underestimated her. Two more, Boyd and Carver, territorial security and trade respectively, who Maria had observed less frequently and knew less thoroughly. And Victor Hale, estate manager, who sat at the table's midpoint with his hands folded and his expression arranged into something professionally neutral that he had clearly practiced on the walk down from his office. Thomas introduced her without preamble or excessive explanation. Maria Langford, human territory representative, effective immediately, appointed under the Alpha King's direct jurisdictional authority. He said it the way he signed documents, with the complete finality of someone who has made a decision and is informing others of it rather than requesting their approval. The council's reactions traveled around the table like a wave. Aldous Crane's eyes went to her clothes and found them acceptable, and her face, and found it unfamiliar, and settled into wary reserve. Patrick Reeve looked immediately interested, the way sharp people look when something new enters the room. Dorothea Wells looked at Maria for a long, steady moment, and then did something no one else at the table did. She gave a single, small, considered nod. Boyd and Carver exchanged a look that was professional enough to be deniable. Victor Hale looked at his folded hands. The meeting was about a boundary renegotiation with the Eastern Hill clans, a complex, multi-year dispute involving water rights and seasonal grazing permissions that Maria had heard discussed in fragments over 3 years of war room observations. She had never heard the full picture from a single meeting. Now she heard it assembled, presented by Patrick Reeve with commendable precision, and she found herself constructing the gaps in his presentation almost involuntarily, the way a person who has been listening to half conversations for years automatically supplies the missing half. When Reeve finished, Thomas looked at her. "Thoughts," he said. Simply that. She was aware of every pair of eyes at the table shifting to her. She let them. She had spent 6 years being invisible. She could afford to take up some space. The Eastern clan's objection to the winter grazing boundary isn't primarily about the grazing, she said. They've raised it as a land use issue, but if you look at the sequence of when they raised it, it follows the water rights adjustment from 3 years ago by about 6 months. They're not trying to expand grazing territory. They're trying to reestablish a negotiating position on the water rights settlement that they feel they were maneuvered out of. The grazing dispute is the door they're using to get back to the table about water. She paused. If you negotiate the grazing boundary in isolation, you'll settle it and have the same argument again in 2 years in a different form. If you acknowledge the water rights subtext directly and offer a limited review process for the original settlement, they'll likely concede the grazing boundary voluntarily as a gesture of good faith. Silence around the table. Patrick Reeve was looking at her with an expression she recognized from watching Thomas look at books he found genuinely challenging. Thomas said nothing, but she felt, without looking at him, the particular quality of his attention. "How do you know the timing sequence?" Reeve asked. Not hostile, genuinely curious. "That's not in any current briefing document." "I've been paying close attention to territorial affairs for some time," Maria said, with a precision that was doing a great deal of work in the same way Thomas's precision often did. The meeting continued. She spoke twice more, once to flag an inconsistency in a proposed trade amendment that Boyd had presented, once to ask a question about the human settlement population count in the southern quadrant that produced a momentary uncomfortable silence, which told her the population count was either outdated or being managed, and she filed that for later. Victor Hale did not speak directly to her. He contributed to the meeting in his normal administrative capacity, voices measured and professional, but she watched him, carefully, indirectly, in the way she had learned to watch things she didn't want to appear to be watching. And she tracked every moment when his eyes moved to her, and every moment when they moved to Thomas, and every moment when they moved, very briefly and very carefully, to his own folded hands. A man checking the time without a watch. A man waiting. The meeting concluded at noon. Thomas dismissed the council, and they filed out in the professional shuffle of people moving to their next obligation. Victor was third to leave, and Maria watched his back as he went through the door and turned right in the corridor, toward the administrative wing, toward his office, with the slightly accelerated step of someone with somewhere to be. She looked at Thomas across the emptying table. He was already looking at her. "He sent a letter this morning," she said. "Didn't he?" Thomas was quiet for precisely 1 second. The eastern border gate reported a Blackthorn liveried rider passing the checkpoint at 10:47, he said. They're coming, Maria said. They'll be here by evening, he said. Possibly sooner if they push. Then we don't have tonight, she said. We have this afternoon. Thomas stood, straightened his jacket, and for the first time since she had stepped out of the walls, he looked, not uncertain. Thomas McFarland did not do uncertain, but fully engaged, the way a person looks when a timeline has been compressed and they are recalculating in real time and finding the recalculation not unwelcome. Victor's office, he said. Now, Victor Hale's office was a large, well-ordered room on the second floor of the administrative wing, with south-facing windows and the particular arranged neatness of a person who uses organization as a form of control. Floor-to-ceiling shelving on 2 walls, labeled and chronological. A wide oak desk clear-surfaced. A locked cabinet along the north wall, iron-banded, old, the kind of cabinet that belongs to a different era of record-keeping than the rest of the room. Thomas had a key for everything in his palace. That was not a surprise. What was in the cabinet was another matter. The locked cabinet contained, on its upper shelf, a set of leather-bound ledgers, administrative records going back 19 years, the full span of Victor's tenure. Below that, a series of document folders organized by year. And at the very back of the middle shelf, behind 2 years of routine correspondence, a thin folder of a different kind. No label, no year marker, filed in the way that things are filed when the goal is technically keeping them while practically ensuring they are never found. Maria had the folder open before Thomas had finished cataloging the ledgers. Her mother's handwriting was on the top sheet. She had not seen her mother's handwriting in 6 years. The script was cramped and careful. The handwriting of a woman who had not written very much as a child and had taught herself in adulthood, each letter formed with deliberate intention, no cursive flourishes, everything legible and precise. Her mother had always written as though writing were an act of consequence. The document was exactly what Thomas had described. The original blood debt agreement, with the Blackthorn seal and the witness signatures. And below it, in her mother's hand, a detailed notation of the discrepancy. A lunar witness date that placed the moon in a phase that would have made the witness impossible under Old Pact law, because the specific witness invoked was a solstice moon rite that required full lunar visibility. And on the date given, the moon had been new. Dark. Invisible. The whole debt was built on a ceremony that could not have taken place as recorded. Maria turned the page. Behind the debt document was a survey land assessment, Southern Territory, Langford parcel, signed by a Blackthorn-employed assessor and valued at a number that explained everything. The land her family had held was worth considerably more than anyone had told them. Mining survey attached. Mineral deposits confirmed. The Blackthorns had known exactly what they were taking when they manufactured the debt. They had stolen her mother's land, her mother's freedom, her mother's future, and eventually her mother's life, with a piece of paper built on an impossible ceremony. And Victor Hale had held the proof of that theft in a locked cabinet for 8 years. Maria's hands were very steady. She was aware of them being steady in the way you are aware of a held breath. The steadiness was not calm. It was the structural result of applying a great deal of internal pressure to a surface to keep it from moving, and the pressure was considerable. Thomas stood beside her and read the documentation in silence. She watched his jaw set with that cold, sustained anger she had catalogued before. The lunar discrepancy is conclusive under Pact law, he said quietly. There is no valid counter-argument. The debt was never legally constituted. No, Maria agreed. It wasn't. Your mother's land belongs to me, Maria said. As her heir. Yes. She closed the folder. She held it. What do you need to dissolve this? She said. What is the exact process under Old Pact law to formally void an invalidly constituted blood debt? A ruling from the Territorial Alpha, he said, issued in the presence of the original debt witnesses, or their documented successors, with the evidence presented on record. The ruling must be witnessed by a minimum of 3 neutral parties. He paused. And ideally, for complete closure under the oldest version of the Pact law, the clan head who filed the debt should be present to hear the dissolution pronounced. Maria looked at him. The Blackthorn clan head is going to be here by evening. Something moved in his expression that was not quite a smile and not quite satisfaction, but lived in the neighborhood of both. Yes, he said. He is. The Blackthorn delegation arrived at 4:43 in the afternoon. Maria knew the exact time because she was standing at the eastern gate when they came through it. Not hiding, not behind a wall, not observing through a grate. Standing. In the open air of the palace courtyard, in the cold February late afternoon light, with the folder of her mother's documentation under one arm and 6 years of accumulated patience expended down to its last careful reserves. There were 4 of them, 2 riders in clan livery, a legal representative carrying a satchel that was the direct descendant of the satchel the thin man had laid on her kitchen table 6 years ago, and the clan head himself, Garrett Blackthorne, who was not what she had expected. She had built a monster in her head. Garrett Blackthorne was not a monster. He was a man in his late 50s, broad-shouldered, with iron-gray hair and the prosperous, settled look of someone who had never in his life been required to consider that his power might be something other than legitimate. He wore authority like a coat he had been born in. He was not cruel-looking. He was not anything-looking. He was simply a man who had always gotten what he wanted because the systems around him had always been arranged to make sure that he did. He saw Maria and stopped. Not the theatrical stop of someone performing surprise. The actual stop of someone whose calculation has just encountered an unexpected variable. Thomas stepped out of the gate arch behind her. "Garrett," he said pleasantly. "Thank you for making the trip on short notice." Garrett Blackthorne looked from Maria to Thomas and back. His legal representative had gone slightly pale. The 2 riders were professionally still. "Thomas," Garrett said. His voice was measured. "Processing. I received a report that there was a situation that required urgent discussion." "There is," Thomas said. He gestured toward the palace doors. "Come inside. We have a great deal to discuss." The formal hearing took place in the Great Hall. The hall Maria had only ever seen from the high grates, whose vaulted ceiling she knew by the sound of its acoustics, whose fireplace she had felt as a warmth pressure change in the upper passages. She stood in it now at the center of its stone floor, the sound returning to her from the walls with the same acoustic signature she had catalogued from above, and felt the strange, complete, dizzying sensation of a thing finally arriving at its correct scale. Thomas sat at the hall's primary table, flanked by Dorothea Wells and Patrick Reeve as neutral counsel witnesses. Victor Hale had been informed of the proceeding and stood at the far wall under the quiet company of 2 palace guards, not restrained, but positioned in a way that made the geometry of the room clear. Garrett Blackthorne sat across the table with his legal representative beside him, hands flat on the table, face arranged in the professional composure of a man who had not yet been shown what was in the folder. Maria stood. Thomas opened the proceeding with the formal language of territorial pact law. Old language, some of it barely used, but all of it precisely applicable. She had heard him use formal language before in the war room, but never this register. This was older, more deliberate, each phrase carrying specific legal weight that accumulated as the proceeding developed, building a structure with the patient architectural logic she had come to recognize as his signature way of doing things. He presented the evidence methodically. The lunar discrepancy first, explained in full, with the pact law citation that made it conclusive. The original document, its date, the moon phase record obtained from the Arkansas Territorial Astronomical Archive that confirmed what her mother had always known. On the night of that ceremony, there had been no moon. The Blackthorne witness record was false. The debt was invalid. Then the land survey. The mineral assessment. The correspondence between the Blackthorne assessor and the clan administration that made the intent clear. This had not been a mistake. This had been a design theft, executed through a manufactured legal mechanism, sustained by a complicit administrative official who had ensured that the one person who could have unraveled it never reached the hearing she was owed. Garrett Blackthorne's face had undergone several revisions during the presentation. The initial composure had given way to a careful stillness, which had given way to the expression of a man in the process of calculating exactly how bad this was and arriving at an answer he didn't like. His legal representative leaned over and said something quiet in his ear. Garrett looked at Thomas. "The documentation chain," he started, "is complete and authenticated," Thomas said. "The Lunar Archive record is signed and sealed by the Territorial Astronomical Registry. The land survey bears your own assessor's signature and your administration's file stamp. The pact law citation is Chapter 7, Section 4 of the Northern Arkansas Clan Accords, which your own family ratified in 1987 and which has not been amended." He paused. "There is no counter-argument, Garrett. I've given you 14 months to find one without telling you I was looking. Garrett went very still. What do you want? He said. Quiet. Stripped of performance. Thomas looked at Maria, and Maria stepped forward. She had been composing this moment for a long time. Not consciously, not all at once, but in fragments over 6 years, the way you compose something in the dark, piece by piece, without being able to see the whole. It had been built from the night in Fayetteville when the thin man laid the document on her mother's table. From the April morning she'd buried her mother without enough money for a proper stone. From every cold night inside the walls when the warmth from the fire was secondhand and filtered through someone else's stone. From the year she'd found her mother's logic in the water pipe and the ceramic bowl. The same practical, quiet, determined intelligence that her mother had carried to the northern border with proof in her hands and had been turned away. She looked at Garrett Blackthorne. My mother's name was Catherine Langford, she said. She was 41 years old when she walked to your northern border with documentation that would have dissolved a debt your family manufactured to steal land that had been in my family for 3 generations. She had a witness record discrepancy that any territorial court would have upheld. She was turned away from this palace by a man you had arranged to keep in place for exactly that purpose. She let that settle. She spent the last 8 years of her life under a debt she never legally owed, on land she had lost to fraud, working herself into an early grave to service a number that your family deliberately made unpayable. She died in April 6 years ago, 3 days before the spring thaw, in a rented house with $2 in her account and a document of proof folded in the bottom of a box that no one ever looked at because there was no one left to look. The great hall was completely silent. I don't want an apology, Maria said. I'm not going to ask for one, because an apology is a personal transaction, and this is not a personal matter. This is a legal matter, and I want it resolved legally. I want the debt formally dissolved under old pact law, in this room, in the presence of witnesses, on the record of the Northern Territorial Archive, with your signature and your seal. I want the land assessment corrected to its actual mineral value, and the difference between the fraudulent valuation and the real one calculated as restitution to the Langford estate. I want it completed tonight, before you leave this hall. She set the folder on the table in front of him. And I want your family's name removed from the witness record of that debt ceremony permanently, she said, so that no version of any document, in any archive, in any territory, suggests that the Langford family ever owed the Blackthorne clan so much as a single day of service. She stepped back. Garrett Blackthorne looked at the folder. He looked at Thomas. He looked at the 2 witnesses and the guards and Victor Hale standing at the far wall with the empty, diminished look of a man whose infrastructure has been removed. He looked at Maria one more time. And then he picked up the pen that Patrick Reeve had placed, with quiet foresight, at the table's edge. He signed. It took 2 hours to complete the formal dissolution. Old Pact law required oral pronouncement as well as written record, and Thomas delivered it in the same ancient register he had used to open the proceeding. Language that was more ceremony than legal code at this point, but which still carried, by the terms of the accords, full territorial authority. The debt was void. The record was amended. The restitution calculation produced a number that made Garrett Blackthorne's legal representative wince. The land in the Southern Territory, or its current assessed value, given that the Blackthornes had already extracted a significant portion of the mineral deposits, would be transferred to the Langford estate within 30 days under bond. When Thomas pronounced the final clause and Patrick Reeve countersigned the record, Maria stood in the center of the great hall of Thornhaven Palace and felt something release in her chest that had been held for so long. She had stopped noticing its presence the way you stop noticing a sound that has been constant long enough to become background. It released all at once. The whole 6 years of it. The 4 days in the Ozarks. The first night in the crack in the eastern foundation. The second-hand warmth of the kitchen fire through the cold stone. Her mother's handwriting on the top sheet of the folder. The thin man's flat voice reading out a number that was designed to be impossible. All of it. Gone. She did not cry. She had learned, in 6 years of solitude, to process large emotional events internally, quietly, in the manner of someone who has no one to perform feeling for, and therefore feels it fully and privately. What she did was stand very still for a moment with her hands at her sides and her eyes on the middle distance, and let the release move through her completely, from the top of her chest to the soles of her bare. No, not bare. She was wearing shoes now. Real ones. It was a small thing and it made her want to laugh, and she didn't let herself, but it was there. The Blackthorn delegation left without ceremony. Garrett moved quickly, with the focused purposefulness of a man who has experienced a significant loss and is already thinking about damage control rather than regret. His legal representative scurried behind him. The riders fell in. The great hall doors closed. Victor Hale remained at the far wall. Thomas turned to him. What followed was brief and surgical, in the way that Thomas handled things when the patience and preparation phase was concluded and the action phase had arrived. Victor did not deny the cabinet. He did not deny the letter. He offered, instead, the explanation of a man who had convinced himself over many years that his actions were in service of stability, that the Blackthorn relationship was politically necessary, that individual human grievances were not worth the territorial disruption of challenging it, that his judgment about what reached the Alpha's attention had been, if not correct, at least defensible. Thomas let him finish. Then he said, "A woman died." 3 words. Quiet. Not a question, not an accusation. A fact, stated in the tone of something being placed permanently on a record. Victor had nothing to say to that. There was nothing to say. He was removed from his position that evening. The terms of his separation were not punitive beyond that. Thomas was not a punishing man, in the theatrical sense. But the estate manager's office was cleared, and Victor Hale's long tenure at Thornhaven Palace ended in the same February cold that had started everything, which Maria thought was fitting, and which she suspected Thomas had considered. 3 days later, Maria stood at the eastern gate of the palace as the afternoon light went long and amber across the courtyard stones. Thomas stood beside her. Not close enough to be a statement. Close enough to be a presence. "The Southern land transfer documents will be ready by end of month," he said. "I know," she said. "The mineral restitution calculation is being finalized. Patrick's team is handling it. I know that too." A pause. The courtyard was quiet. The dog she had seen that first morning was making another cross from the stables, unhurried. "You could leave," Thomas said. "That was never the arrangement, staying here. You have land and a restitution settlement coming. You have options now." She looked at the gate. At the road beyond it, leading south through the Ozarks, through the territory she had crossed 4 days and 6 years ago. She thought about what was down that road. The southern flatlands, the ordinary Arkansas she had come from, the rented houses and the diner shifts and the life that was technically available to her now that the weight had been lifted. "You still need a human council representative," she said. "I do. And the population count in the southern quadrant," she said. "That's being managed, isn't it?" The number Patrick presented in the meeting was low. "By approximately 12%, Thomas said, "which affects resource allocation in ways that have been convenient for certain council interests." "That's the next thing," she said. "After the transfer and the restitution. That's what needs addressing." "Yes," he said. "It is." She was quiet for a moment. The amber light moved across the courtyard. The dog disappeared through the east door. "The room on the second floor," she said. "The one with the window over the north courtyard." "What about it?" "I've been sleeping there 3 nights now," she said. "And I keep waking up and putting my palm against the wall." She looked at the gate, at the amber light, at the long road south. "Not because I want to go back in," she said, "but because the walls know things. The walls remember everything that was said in them, everything that happened near them, everything they held. The stones don't forget." She turned to look at him. "I don't want to forget either. What it cost. What my mother carried. What it felt like to be on the wrong side of every room." Thomas looked at her. That full, layered, complete gaze. "You won't," he said. "No," she agreed. "I won't. That's why I'm staying." The light went amber to gold. The courtyard held its silence. "The council meets Monday," Thomas said. "I know," Maria said. "I'll be there." She turned from the gate and walked back across the courtyard. Not the walk of someone haunting a space, not the crouched, compressed movement of someone navigating a passage 18 inches wide, but the full, unhurried, uncompressed walk of someone who belongs where they are going. Behind her, she heard Thomas fall into step. Not catching up. Not leading. Simply walking beside her. The walls of Thornhaven Palace still stood, as they had stood for 200 years, cold and thick, and full of the memory of everything that had ever happened near them. The eastern passage still ran behind the kitchen wall. The ventilation grates still let light through in long amber slits. The stone steps still curved upward at their shallow angle to the second floor. worn smooth by use and thick with dust that no one had disturbed in years. But at the base of the eastern kitchen wall, in the hollow where a 20-year-old woman had once pressed her back against warm stone and listened to a fire breathe and felt, for the first time, something like safety. In that hollow, the dust had been recently disturbed. Not by Maria. She had not been back. By Thomas. He had gone there once, alone, the night after she had come out. Not to inspect it, not to assess it. He had crouched in the narrow passage with a candle and looked at the small hollow and the worn patch of stone where someone had spent 6 years sleeping with their back against the warmth, and he had stayed for a few minutes, and then he had gone back upstairs. He had not told Maria, but she knew. She had heard his footsteps in the passage from her room above. She still read the palace by its sounds, still knew the difference between a guard's measured step and Thomas's deliberate one, would probably always know, the way you always know the voice of someone who kept you warm when they didn't have to. She didn't ask. Some things didn't need to be spoken to be understood. The walls knew. The stones remembered. And in the morning, Maria Langford sat at the council table in the great hall of Thornhaven Palace. Not behind the wall, not through a grate, not in the dark, and she put her hands flat on the table, and she opened her mouth, and she made sure that every voice that had been turned away from these doors would be heard. It was not everything. It was not even most things. The work was long and the systems were old, and the rot that Victor Hale represented was not an anomaly but a pattern. And patterns required patience and preparation, and the willingness to keep showing up at the table even when the table pushed back. But she was there. She was there. And the walls that had been her shelter, her prison, her school, her strange and improbable salvation. The walls were at her back now instead of around her. She had learned everything they had to teach. The rest was hers to build. She hid in the Alpha King's palace walls for 6 years. He caught her and said, "Pay me your rent." And what she paid him back with, slowly, stubbornly, one council meeting at a time, was a justice that outlasted both of them. Some debts aren't owed to the person who demands them. Some debts are owed to the ones who came before. Catherine Langford walked to the northern border with proof in her hands. Her daughter walked back out through the front door. And this time, nobody turned her away. N. Maria Langford spent 6 years hidden in the walls before Thomas McFarland changed everything. If you want to see more werewolf fantasy stories like this one, subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. Share your thoughts about Maria's journey in the comments below, and tap the video on your screen to discover another thrilling werewolf tale where secrets, power, and forbidden romance collide.